Hello everyone. My name is Ritu Thaman, and as chair and co-chair of WIC Communications, I am delighted to have you all join us with Dr. Suzanne Koven, who I will briefly introduce as she will then talk to us about her latest book, Letter to a Young Female Physician. Dr. Suzanne Koven received her BA in English Literature from Yale and her MD from Johns Hopkins. She holds an MFA in nonfiction from the Bennington Writing Seminars. After her residency training at Johns Hopkins Hospital, she joined the faculty of Harvard Medical School and has practiced primary care internal medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital for over 30 years. She's an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and holds the Valerie Winchester Family Endowed Chair in Primary Care Medicine at Mass General. In 2019, she was named the inaugural Writer in Residence at Mass General. Her essays, articles, blogs, and reviews have appeared in the Boston Globe, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet New Yorker, Psychology Today, the LA Review of Books, Stat, and other publications. Her monthly column in Practice appeared in the Boston Globe. Her book that she will be talking from was published in May of 2021 by W.W. Norton. So it is my great pleasure to have Dr. Suzanne Koven start the discussion. Thank you so much for everyone for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is a real pleasure. I see my dear friend and colleague, Melissa Wood, on the screen there. Hi, Melissa. I'm sure I have met others of you, if not in real life, on the interwebs at some point. And it's a real pleasure to be here. So what I thought I would do is just tell you a little bit about the somewhat unorthodox career that led to the writing of this book, and then kind of focus in on the cardiology aspect of the book. Those of you who have read the book will know what I'm talking about. Those of you who haven't read the book will soon know what I'm talking about. And I am going to share my screen. And here we go. Whoop. You don't need to see the Max Mara ad. There we go. Okay. So I'm, for reasons that will become apparent shortly, I'm going to call this My Mother's MI. You know, I don't know if this is still a thing, as the kids say, but when I was in training, we used to talk about how when somebody came in with chest pain, uh, the three important things to focus on were the EKG, the enzymes, and the story. And having been an English major, oops, something's going on there. Having been an English major who in college aspired to be a journalist, you can guess which of these three things interested me the most. But I didn't become a journalist after college, at least not until decades later. I went to medical school. And in fact, by this point, and now this is a bit about my story, here I am as a chief resident at Johns Hopkins. Got my shoulder pads and my bad 80s hair. I would have told you at the time that this moment was the culmination of a choice. Those of you cardiologists may know the guy on the left in the front row was my co-chief, Roy Ziegelstein, who's a cardiologist at Hopkins. Anyway, I would have said I made my choice. I was not going to be a humanities person. I was not going to be a writing person. Instead, I was going to be a medicine and science person. Well, of course, this was really wrong-headed. It took me a long time to figure out how wrong-headed. The Greeks knew how wrongheaded it was. Apollo, after all, was the god of both medicine and poetry. Here he is with his lyre for poetry, the snake for medicine, put in terms that I think are more congenial to our modern sensibilities. We know that we have a right brain and a left brain. We might think about the left brain as being more sort of science oriented, the right brain being more creative, holistic, and sort of involved with the arts. And yet, we also know, those of us who practice medicine, or indeed those of us who do scientific research, not me, that you need both sides of your brain to do these things effectively. And to think that you can divide one from the other or use one exclusively is really just not true. Now, just sort of something that interests me a lot is the role of storytelling in medicine. And this is something that I looked into a while back. This is the first known medical case history on something called the Edwin Smith Papyrus, dated 1600 BC. Now, if your hieroglyphics are rusty, I will provide a translation here. These were a series of cases, and they all follow the same pattern. The pattern is, when you see someone with a particular problem, in this case, someone with a split skull, here's what you should do. I think it's interesting. It says, make for him 2 supports of brick. So this was an ancient Egyptian cervical collar for a trauma patient. And then here's the part that interests me the most. Thou should do likewise for every man whom thou findest having a split skull. So in other words, you take the specific and you apply it to the general. And after all, that is how literature works. That's how fiction works. Why do we read David Copperfield, or The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, or Anna Karenina, or The Girl on the Train, or, if I've got that title right, there's a lot of titles that have girls and trains. We read it to find out what's next, to be entertained, to be moved. But really, the essence of it is that we care about the one individual, Anna Karenina, because of what she can tell us about human nature, human beings in general, indeed, what she can tell us about ourselves. So the specific to the general is how storytelling works. And it really is, I think, also how medicine works. And of course, is how medicine is taught. How do we teach medicine? We use the case method. We give students, general idea about the causes of atherosclerosis, and then we tell them about this one, and we have them examine that one and the next one, each individual building up resonance about the whole. Here's another way of thinking about the similarities between narrative of storytelling and medicine. So when I was 52, I went back to grad school and got my MFA. So it's never too late if this is a dream of yours to write. You are not far behind. I got my MFA at 52 and have published my first book at well over 60. So you're not behind. Anyway, so in this program, I learned about something called the Freytag pyramid, which is essentially a schema of how a story works. You start out with the introduction of the main character, the protagonist, Cinderella, mean stepsisters, etc. And then there's some stuff that happens. There's going to be a ball. leading to a climax, 12 o'clock. And then there's a bunch of other stuff that happens, loses the slipper. There's a resolution, finds the prince, a denouement, happily ever after. When I first saw this, I thought, this looks really familiar. I feel like I've seen this before. And in fact, of course, I had, and so have you. This is how we tell medical stories. What is the exposition, after all, but the chief complaint? The protagonist is the patient. The rising action is the history of the present illness. The climax is what brings them in to the emergency room or the clinic. The resolution or the denouement is the assessment and plan. In addition, in narrative, we talk about the backstory. You know how you're reading a book and then there's a space break, and then we learn about something that happened when the main character was a child. Well, um, in narrative, we call it the backstory. In medicine, we call it the past medical history. It's really the same thing. Okay, so enough of that wonkiness. Thank you for bearing with me. I just love this stuff. Given what I've said, is it any surprise that there have been many more physician writers than, say, engineer writers, lawyer writers, or architect writers? There have been a lot of physician writers and some very fine nurse writers too, by the way, not least of which was Louise May Alcott, who was a nurse in the Civil War. And here's one of my favorites, William Carlos Williams. He was a practicing physician. He practiced, I guess we would call it now family medicine. He did mostly pediatrics and OB out of his house in Rutherford, New Jersey, in the first half of the 20th century. He wrote poems, what are considered some of the greatest modernist poems, on his prescription pads. And he said in his autobiography, as a writer, I have been a physician, and as a physician, a writer. Just for fun, I decided to, off the top of my head, make a kind of chronological list of physician writers. This is by no means a complete list. It was just the ones I could think of while I was making this slide. And I noticed something kind of interesting, which is that we start off very white and male, and we start getting much more diverse as we get to the late 20th, early 21st century. And as I started listing um, uh, some of the younger physician writers I'm admiring now, people in their 20s, 30s, and early 40s, predominantly female, and ample representation from communities of color and from the LGBTQ community. So I think we're moving in sort of a really wonderful direction in this sphere in terms of a diversity of voices. Okay, so maybe you're thinking about writing, but there's a lot of reasons you think maybe you shouldn't. Let me anticipate them for you. They're all the ones that I've said to myself, that I said to myself along this way. We're worried that our stories aren't good enough. We think we're being self-indulgent if we write about ourselves. We're worried about patient confidentiality. That's a legitimate worry, but one we can certainly work with. We think maybe it'll be too revealing, too unprofessional, like, maybe my boss shouldn't know that I have liposuction. As a medical student, we think that stories are, quote, anecdotal medicine, that they're unscientific. That's really been drilled into us, hasn't it? And we think our stories are too small in relation to big problems. I can come up with sort of answers to assuage your fears about all of these, but that would use up my whole talk, and I won't. I'll simply say that all of these, if I can be permitted to practice psychiatry without a license for a moment, all of these are resistance. I think all of these are ways we have of telling ourselves that the stories we want to tell, we shouldn't tell. But we should tell them, and we must tell them We don't all have to publish. We don't all have to write personally. But if you feel the urge to do this, I'm here to tell you that these aren't reasons that should hold you back. There's lots of different ways of being a physician writer. You can, write for editorials, advocacy, op-eds. You can write to educate the public or your peers, or you can do what I do, which is write pretty personally. I didn't choose this, it chose me. And how do you know? Well, whenever I published something that wasn't personal, it didn't sound like me. It was sort of like wearing shoes that were the wrong size. And it just didn't feel right. And you know when you're not being authentic. And I just didn't. So I stick with what works for me, what feels right for me. So here's an example of a pretty personal piece that ended up in a pretty well, a place that historically was not known much for personal writing, now has become a wonderful venue of personal writing, which is the New England Journal. What happened here, what led to this piece, was really a single moment. And if I can offer you a piece of writing advice that I give to the many mentees that I work with on their writing, clinician writers, it's that I think it's very paralyzing to say, I'm going to write about X, like some really big thing, like the history of women in medicine or my whole life or something like that. It's too big. I think what's much more fruitful and really has been the basis for every single essay I've ever written and published is to choose a tiny moment where you just were sort of caught short and you said, whoa, wow, why do I feel this way? Why am I moved? Why is this funny? Why is this pissing me off? Whatever it is, if you don't know the answer, you know that that is really sort of fertile ground. If you already know the answer, if you already know everything you think about this thing, don't bother writing about it. It'll be dead in the water. It'll be boring. It'll be boring to you. You know, we've all been taught to write like in middle school, topic, sentence. Um, Somebody is wanting to annotate the shared content. Sure, go for it. Um, um, we were all taught to write topic, sentence, body, conclusion. Thus I have shown. It's a terrible way to write. It's really boring, and it's not the way anybody you like reading writes. I guarantee you that if you've read something that you've really enjoyed, it means that the person writing it was writing it in a spirit of discovery and surprise. So what happened here was that it was late June of 2016. I was asked to participate in an exercise for incoming medical interns at Mass General. They were writing a letter to their future selves and it was going to be handed back to them 6 months into their internship when they were on a retreat. And I don't know, I wasn't that into it. I hadn't designed the exercise, and I was sort of asked to do it at the last minute, and I was a little grumpy about the whole thing. But all of a sudden, as I looked around the table and I saw that more than half of the interns were women, and that they were hunched, over, their letters, I found myself unexpectedly moved, like almost to tears moved. And I asked myself, what is that about? And at this point, I'd been writing long enough to know that if I didn't know what it was about, that was a sign that I should write about it. So I decided that what I wanted to write was a letter to myself exactly 30 years, almost to the day, from when this exercise took place, and to tell myself how my career would unfold. I had good news. and bad news for myself. The bad news was that there would still be a tremendous amount of gender inequity 30 years later, shocking amount of gender inequity 30 years later in medicine. And the advice I had for myself 30 years ago was not to spend so much time and energy worrying that I was a fraud, an imposter, and so forth. Well, this thing kind of went viral, or as viral as anything in the New England Journal goes, unless it's a big discovery. And it was really kind of amazing. It got picked up by the lay press, and I got mail from people all over the world, not just young people, female people, or physician people. It seems that it kind of tapped into a nerve. Oops. Whatever somebody just did in annotating made it that I can no longer advance my slides. Yes, no, don't annotate. Can whoever was annotating stop doing that? Because there's now a little crayon on the screen and I can't advance my slide. It's locked. That first person who requested annotation.
Might want to stop sharing your screen and then share again. This has happened before.
Oh dear.
Worth a try.
Okay. All right, I'll stop and I'll start. Okay. I'll see if I can talk and share at the same time. That's unlikely. Okay, here we go. Okay. Are we back? We're back. Okay, great. Thanks. Anyway, okay. So it went kind of viral, and to make a very long story short, I was contacted by an editor, and it became a book, but not the book I thought I was writing. And here we get to the cardiology part. The book I thought I was writing was the story of how I had entirely bungled the diagnosis of my mother's angina and massive MI, which she presented to my emergency room, diagnosed by my colleagues at Mass General after she had been under my roof for 2 days, complaining of left shoulder pain and orthopnea. Now, in my defense, her cardiologist and her internists in 2 different places had also missed the signs, which in retrospect had been gathering for about 1.5 years. She herself had been going to a physical therapist for her pesky rotator cuff problem, which, by the way, was miraculously cured when she infarcted. And what I thought I was writing initially was a memoir about our complicated relationship, her complicated relationship with her own health as a doctor's wife, the difficult duality of my roles as her daughter and her medical advisor. But I sort of wasn't getting anywhere with it. And what I ultimately realized, just as I said, I write personally because that's what chose me. I realized I really am an essayist, not a memoirist. And so this became an essay or a couple of essays within a collection of essays, really about my whole life through the lens of medicine, starting as growing up as the daughter of a doctor. My dad was an orthopedic surgeon, and going past my mom's death to my own sort of imminent old age and impending retirement no time soon, in case any of my my patients are watching. But let me tell you a little bit more about my mom. So this was my parents at my wedding 40 years ago. And my mom was 10 years younger than my dad. And he was obese and sedentary, and she was relatively slender and active. And she worried throughout their whole 55-year-old marriage that every time she left the house and came back, he would have, oh, and he, by the way, he smoked, kept his cigarettes in the pocket of his scrub shirt. Those were the days. And she worried every day for 55 years that every time she left the house and came back, he would have dropped dead of a heart attack. And I think this was sort of part of a narrative that was particularly promoted in the 50s and 60s and 70s, that men, particularly successful men, were at risk of heart disease, and that women, well, it didn't even really apply to them. And that attitude persists, as you know, I don't have to tell you, to this day, where we women worry much more about breast cancer than about heart disease, and heart disease is much more likely to kill us. Anyway, truth of the matter was, though, my mother had some risk factors for cardiovascular disease. She had hypertension, which was treated, hyperlipidemia, which was treated. She had a pretty high-fat diet. She had smoked back when everybody smoked, and she had a tremendous amount of stress caring for my chronically ill father, who had emphysema, not surprisingly, and a number of other medical issues. She did not think of herself as at risk of heart attack, but she did think of herself as a heart patient. She'd been told when she was in her 50s that she had mitral valve prolapse, and that was what made her anxious. And so she was taking cardizem and Xanax for the last 20 years of her life, believing that the reason she was anxious was because of her mitral valve. We know, of course, now that the association of mitral valve prolapse and anxiety is slim at best, that this was sort of the hysteria or asthenia of the 80s, when echocardiography was on the rise, and all women were told that they had mitral valve prolapse. Just to cut to the punchline, when she had a echocardiogram at the end of her life, it turned out she never had it in the first place. But this is essentially what happened to her. I won't go through all the particulars, but basically, she married Coretti, my fellow intern. I haven't seen you in 30 years. Hi. She just entered.
Suzanne.
Anyway.
Sorry, I'm late.
That's okay. Anyway, so my mom was a lawyer. She went to law school in her 40s. She retired in the 90s. In about 2002, she stopped playing tennis. Her doubles partner told her that she was too slow to get to the net. She also started having this intermittently achy rotator cuff on the left. That was self-diagnosed. She took care of my dad in his final years. He died in June of 2004, at which point she thought, well, okay, now I guess I can, kind of pick up and move on. But that isn't what happened. 6 months later, she kept calling me and saying, I'm so tired. I'm so tired. This was most unlike her. And then a couple months later, it was found that the CLL that she had monitored for several years had morphed into lymphoma. I brought her up to Boston for her first round of chemotherapy. The next day or so, she kept saying that that rotator cuff was just worse than ever. Plus, she was extremely anxious. That Barlow syndrome was really acting up, and it was making her very short of breath. And finally, I sent her to a colleague who wheeled her immediately to the emergency room where she had had a massive anterior MI. So, in the aftermath of this, I sort of conducted my own personal M&M. Uh, how could I have missed this? I'm a practitioner of women's health. I've been doing this for a long time. How did I miss such an obvious diagnosis? And I thought about a few possibilities. One is like maybe I'm just bad at cardiology. It never was, I confess to you, my best subject. I don't do electric circuits and pumps as well as I do stories. But, you know, come on, if this had been some random patient who had come to me with this story, I would have made the diagnosis much earlier. Uh, then I sort of entertained the possibility that maybe she had, this sort of classic hard to diagnose heart disease because she was a woman. Except the fact of the matter was, she had an almost totally occluded LAD. This is her little cath diagram. Uh, she had, in fact, not to put too fine a point on it, she had a widowmaker. She was the widow with the widowmaker. Um, there was nothing atypical about her case. Well, there was the fact that she was my mother. And of course, we know that the AMA Code of Ethics tells us that we probably shouldn't be treating ourselves or our families, though of course we all do it, to some extent. And of course, it is hard to be objective about the medical condition of people you love. But again, not this unobjective. What I came down to is that what happened to her, and I don't know how this will land with you, uh, you'll you'll have to tell me, is that the story that she had for herself did not include having heart disease. And I think this was the story she told herself, she told everyone else. Her story was, if someone here is going to get heart disease, it's going to be my husband. I'm fine. Now he's gone, and I'm going to be the merry widow. She said that to me any number of times. Well, now I guess I'll be the merry widow. And so when she started to get sick, all we could think of for a long time was that, well, she must be grieving. She's tired. She must be grieving. My parents had a very happy marriage. It was 55 years. It's a tremendous loss. And the story that she had, that I had for her, I think blinded both of us. And I think she had many of her doctors convinced as well. So this is just the last picture I'll show. So this was 2 years after her MI, which she survived. And this was at my youngest child's bar mitzvah. My mom was about to turn 80. She's looking pretty fine. She's wearing her St. John Couture knit jacket. And she was buried in that jacket 2 years later at her request. She looks fine. She wasn't fine. She was never fine after the MI. The hand you see is my brothers. She's being propped up, putting on a good face. She had a series of embolic strokes, which ultimately killed her. But this, what she looks like here, is what she thought was going to be. This moment is what she thought was going to be. What I'd like to do now is just read you very briefly from the book, sort of riffing off of that moment. And if your camera's not on, and you can turn it on, turn it on. I love to see faces. I have you on gallery view. Particularly you, Mary Coretti. I haven't seen you in
Suzanne, I know. I'm so sorry
30
I'm late.
years.
I just
Look at
finished your
you.
book. Congratulations.
You're
It was
gorgeous.
absolutely brilliant.
Mary and I, in July of 1986, Mary and I started on the same floor together as interns.
That's right.
It was a 4-woman team,
That's
which
right.
was a bit unusual then. Anyway, okay. So this won't need any introduction because you just had the introduction. In the weeks and months after my mother's heart attack, I found it hard to believe that it had actually happened. I struggled to make it real for myself. I recalled articles I'd read about the high incidence of myocardial infarction among those who care for chronically ill family members and among new widows. I reminded myself of my mother's diet, the decades of Philadelphia cream cheese in silver packages with blue writing, cheese omelets and BLTs, hamburgers and steaks and prime rib and liver topped with bacon, and my mother's favorite, tongue sandwiches with Swiss cheese and Russian dressing. I pictured the cloud of smoke from my father's cigarettes that had enveloped my mother for decades. Why wouldn't she have had a heart attack? A few years later, I requested the records of my mother's 2005 hospital admission from the company contracted by Mass General to store charts from the pre-digital era. After several weeks, they finally appeared in my mailbox at home, a 5-inch thick stack of papers encased in one of those fiber-impregnated mailing envelopes, flimsy yet strong and too large for its contents. My first thought, lifting the heavy parcel, shifting awkwardly in its loose white wrapper, was of a corpse in a body bag. I carried it inside, set it on my desk, and there it sat, unopened, for days. One part of my mother's record intrigued me, especially the diagram of her coronary arteries drawn by the cardiologist who had performed her catheterization soon after she arrived in the emergency room. It showed the blockage in her left anterior descending artery, the widowmaker, and a number of smaller blockages. I contacted Dennis, who'd been a year behind me in residency and who'd become one of the foremost authorities in the world on cardiac catheterization. I emailed him a copy of the diagram, and over the phone, Dennis reviewed it with me patiently. I interrupted him several times to ask whether my mother may have had an atypical form of coronary disease, one that might easily have gone undetected for months and more likely to be seen in a woman, perhaps. He said she did not. Finally, I just came right out with it. Dennis, I asked, did I kill my mother? He laughed. Then he said, wait, what? As if he hadn't heard me correctly. Did you kill your mother? I told him about the months of fatigue and the left shoulder pain and her persistent cough, the days she lived in my house complaining of how short of breath she became when she lay flat. And Dennis said, no, geez, come on. She was old and sick, and she had coronary atherosclerosis, the most common cause of death in the world. He made it sound as if I'd blamed myself for the sun going down. When someone you love suffers, you fail to protect them. This may seem irrational and unfair, but in the largest sense, it's true. And if you have medical training and you don't prevent someone you love from becoming ill and dying, you feel an even greater sense of failure. Why couldn't I do for my mother what I'd done for other people's mothers? Why couldn't I have done better for her? I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to take your comments, questions about the book, about writing, about anything.
That was very powerful writing and reading, and we are so grateful for you having the courage to share so much of yourself completely with us. You know, it's a rare glimpse for us to see a physician writing about things that we all have experienced and know so intimately. I would like to start with the question, unless somebody else has one, just to get things rolling. It was interesting in one of your chapters in the beginning on clinical skills when you say, I aspired to be an actor, and my new costume and props made me feel as if I were on stage. How have you, could you share a little bit more about that feeling and how that has been sort of amplified in this COVID era of Zoom?
Oh, how interesting. What a great question. Well, first of all, in a way, I don't really have to amplify on the feeling of medicine as performance because you have all experienced it. Is everybody here a physician? Yeah. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. It's like you put your hand on the knob of that exam room, you pull back the curtain of that hospital room, and you can almost hear another opening of another. I mean, you know, it's not in a bad way, right? Not in a fake way, but there is um, a heightened attention, a heightened sense of how you are being perceived that is not, you know, what you're, you know, it's not like you're, you know, watching Netflix with your partner and having beers. I mean, it's a different energy, right? Now, in terms of Zoom, well, it depends whether you mean seeing patients virtually. I think that's a very interesting question. And I don't know, probably most of you have done that. Um, uh, I find it fascinating. I mean, it sort of breaks down the barriers, particularly in those early days when some of us, we were home and the patient was home and we had the blurry background or like the fancy building or whatever, but we were wearing our fuzzy slippers and they were wearing their fuzzy slippers. And this person you've known for 20 years, now you see what their dog looks like and what kind of pictures they have on their wall. I thought that was a very interesting phenomenon. In terms of Zoom performing, which is what I'm doing right now, it's yeah, I mean it's a little bit different than other kinds of public speaking. I've done so much of it that it's actually made me hoarse. I had to go get nasal endoscopy to be told that my diagnosis was that I talked too much, which amused my family no end. Anyway, true story. Melissa, my friend.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for sharing this with the ACC WIC group. It's always so amazing. I love your book, and I have always learned so much from you, both in the way that I know how you care for your patients because I take care of a lot of them, and they, adore you. So not only can you express yourself in the written word, but also in the spoken word and in the care you provide to your patients. You know, one of the things, I'm the incoming chair of the Board of Governors for the college. And so, you know, if we can affect change with the chapters, then it can really affect our members. And one of the things, as you know, we're struggling with is clinician well-being. And I have found personally that writing is very therapeutic. And do you have suggestions for ways that as leaders in the college, we can engage our members who perhaps have never really thought about writing as a way of helping improve their wellness, like steps that we could take, especially perhaps for our male colleagues who may think, well, that's not something I've really liked to do, or our colleagues that just haven't thought about it. Because I think it's a wonderful way to help us get out of this funk that we're all in. But I think
Yeah.
packaging it is important.
Yeah. Great question. You know, so much, and thank you for those very kind words. And you, of course, your patients think the same of you. I hope you know that. You know, part of this funk that we're in, I believe, is part of the same funk our patients are in, which is just a tremendous sense of isolation that we all feel, just sort of going around in our own little things. I think that. I think offering, yes, I agree, writing is a good thing, but offering settings where people can talk freely is just magic. You know, one of my favorite things to do is, you know, I run this monthly reading discussion group, and boy, you just get people talking, and it's like you're giving, you know, water to somebody who's been shipwrecked. I mean, there is just such a hunger to share the deepest meaning of our work. And let's face it, I mean, our work is more deeply meaningful than a lot of people's work, and yet we don't have any chance to sort of share it. In terms of writing and narrative itself, you know, there's lots of people who do this. Invite me to come around and gather up all the menfolk, and I'll get them reading poetry and writing in no time. Give me an hour on Zoom, we'll get it done. I actually do a lot of that on Zoom, by the way. It's great fun. Um, I do see someone without. I can't see your name. Actually, in this platform, if you can't see the person's name. Oh, no, Deborah. Yeah, if you
Yeah,
scroll over, you can see. Deborah, you have your hand up.
I do. I just wanted to say the only thing I've ever thought of writing about is medicine, not so much experiences, but it was amazing to hear you speak, because I think one of the things that came to me is how when we're thinking of writing something down, we always feel like we're the one that this has happened to, and you know, other people may not be interested because it doesn't apply for them. But almost always it actually applies to a lot of people when you think of just how many people there really are out there. And in particular, when you were talking, your story could so easily have been mine. I was a cardiology fellow at the time. I guess was a resident in England, and my father started to complain of indigestion every time he walked up the hill to church after a really big Sunday morning breakfast. And, you know, I was actually astute enough immediately to think, you know, why at your age, diabetic, hypertensive, are you going to suddenly develop indigestion walking uphill? You know, I knew what it was, basically. I knew what it was, but my father was very stubborn. And when I told him that I wanted to take him into the hospital and come and visit me so we'd go on a treadmill, and I lived quite a long way away, he insisted that yes, he would come, but not until after he went on a camping holiday with my mum in the Pyrenees mountains. And you know, I didn't really press hard to stop him from going. And if he had died on that holiday, I would have been feeling, forever. Oh my God, I'm sure I could have stopped him. I'm actually not sure that I could have done, but
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you're making a great point, which is that which is something I think about a lot, which is that what makes a great story is not enormous drama. Like there's a lot of people who have been to war or have been to prison who haven't written great novels. And, Jane Austen like sat in her house for her whole life and she wrote great novels. So it's Alice Munro, if some of you are fans, the great Canadian Nobel laureate, she wrote about, lonely women on the Canadian prairie. And it was fascinating because it's just all in the telling, and the telling has to be deeply truthful. And in terms of thinking our own stories don't matter, I give you sort of two examples from my own, in my own experience with this, where I was sure I was about to embarrass myself terribly, and it turned out not to be. With this piece, the original New England Journal piece, the letter, right before it went to press, I thought, well, luckily only a couple of people are going to be interested in this because it's really, I mean, come on. I mean, who wants to hear about my imposter syndrome? Well, 300,000 hits later, it turns out that other people felt the same way. And by the way, I got a lot of mail on that piece, and not a single piece of mail said, wow, I can't believe what an imposter you are. How could you even be a doctor? No, the mail wasn't about me at all. The mail was about the reader. It was about, oh, this reminds me of how I feel. The other example, though, was at the beginning of COVID. Um, our hospital, like everybody's hospital, set up tents and makeshift wards and stuff and new screening clinics and so forth. And they asked for volunteers to staff them. And I deleted the email because, like I'm old, I don't do stuff like that, right? Except, like they sent around stuff about you want to be waivered, you want to learn a new IT thing. It's like delete, 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 delete. I don't have to do this anymore. Except, like I walked around for 2 days after that, just feeling sort of anxious and restless and feeling like something was wrong. And I retrieved the email and I volunteered in the clinic. And again, it was one of those moments. Well, what was that discomfort? I wrote into it, I identified it, and I published it in the New England Journal. And I thought, wow, this is before it was appeared. I thought, wow, you got some nerve. There are literally people dying. This is when, like, people in Elmhurst were dying. And you're writing your little 1,200 word sob story about who, boo hoo, you're so old and you're working in the COVID clinic. You're such a hero. Wow, wow, wow. But that wasn't the response. The response was from the front lines saying, thank you for speaking for us. And why? Because I told my truth. And because when you tell your truth, you're telling other people's truth too. Dawn, you have been very, oops, not Dawn. Oh, the boxes moved. Rosa, that was tricky.
I'm Maria
Yes.
Rosa.
Yes.
I'm Costanzo, and my question to you pertains to creativity and the way that we grew up. So as I was growing up, I always had to be the best in the class, the highest grades possible, and the feeling that failure was not an option. And moving forward to most recent years, I think we are about the same age. I remembered when my dad retired as a physician that he was completely lost. He had no other interests beside medicine. So I said, I'm not going to let that happen to me. There are things that I like to do. And in my case, is photography. And then I realized how my upbringing was really crushing my creativity.
Yeah.
Because instead of saying, okay, I'm going to take a picture and I'm going to make mistakes so I learn, I was always thinking, okay, I have to make the best picture ever of this subject.
Right. Yeah. You've touched on my one of my favorite themes. And this is I think the main challenge for doctors who are interested in writing or any of the other arts, which is we do tend to be rather perfectionistic. We are all A+ students. We want a gold star for everything. And that's how and we want to be right about everything and never make a mistake. So after my first workshop in graduate school, my teacher asked to see her after class. And I thought, I can't be in trouble already. We only had one class. And she said to me, I just want you to know, I think this is going to be hard for you. And I said, why? Like, am I dumb or what? She said, it's going to be hard for you because you're coming from a profession where it's really important to do things quickly, efficiently, and correctly. And you're trying to enter a profession where it's really important to make lots and lots of mistakes. And so here's the way this translates, and I think you'll recognize this in photography, is like some of you here might even be thinking, oh wow, like I could do this because like look at her, she's like really old and she did it like when she was really old. I totally have time, I could do this. And like, there's this one patient who has just been in my mind, and I've like always wanted to tell the story of this amazing thing that happened. So far, so good, right? Okay. And then you go, okay. And then you go, this sucks. And then you think, oh, I guess I'm bad at this. I guess I can't do this. You are bad at it. So am I. I'm bad at it every single time. But you do it, and then you sort of sift through it, and there's like one sentence in it that maybe has something good in it, and then you keep going. And you show it to other people knowing it's bad so that they can respond to it. This is so completely opposite from what we are trained to do that we can't even believe that it's legal. And yet, in fact, there is no alternative. If you think what's going to happen is that you're going to just go like this and you're going to get an A+ from the New England Journal or the New Yorker or wherever, that isn't the way it works. You have to make a mess, and you have to show other people your mess, and you have to show yourself your mess, and you have to keep going anyway. But here's the thing. This is what I've been saying a lot, but I actually want to amend it to say that actually, and tell me what you think, actually, I'm not so sure that medicine is that different from this, particularly early in our careers, early in our training, those times when we say, I don't have any idea what's going on. When you're sitting in an exam room with a patient and they're talking and you're sitting there saying, I have no idea what this is. And so then what do? Well, because the stakes are high, you don't pretend you know.
No.
You figure it out. You read, you talk, you make a little bit of a mess, you come back. So thank you for raising that. That's, I think, a really important point. Do we have time for one more? Yes, one more? No? Anyone else want to make a comment?
So, in kind of a similar vein, one of my favorite parts of your book was when you were talking about some of your parenting advice. And my husband and I are expecting our first, and you just can't study for parenting the way you can for echo boards.
Well, you can, but it's pointless.
Yeah. So, your line about you know more than you think you do, and I was like, that is going to be my new parenting philosophy. So I wanted to thank you for that.
Well, that was actually Dr. Spock's line. But it is true. I think that well, just spoiler alert, what cured me of my imposter syndrome ultimately, and it took a few decades, was realizing that the things in my life I was most proud of were pretty messy, were pretty imperfect processes. And like in terms of child rearing, and I have 3 grown kids and grandchildren now, and talk about an imperfect process. I mean, when I bring this up with patients who I can tell have real sort of all or nothing thinking about their diet and weight. I mean, we've all seen this, right? It's like, well, I was really good for a while and then I was really bad. And to which I always say, like bad, like rob a bank bad, like murder bad, or like, cheesecake bad. And I always say, but like think about this. If you're raising a child, do you sort of wake up Monday morning and you say, I'm going to be a perfect parent, and then like Tuesday afternoon, you yell at the kid, and then Wednesday, you just start beating them up because who cares anymore? I mean, that's not what these processes are like. They're messy and ugly and imperfect and embarrassing and ultimately beautiful in all of their mess. So Mazel Tov on the baby. It's a really, it's a really wonderful thing. It will completely ruin your life. Um, but in a good way, and only for 20 years or so. So don't worry about it. You'll be fine. Um, Anything else? Any other burning comments?
Well,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne.
It was my
Yeah.
pleasure. Mary,
Yes.
it's so
Yes.
good to see you.
Yeah, I'm sorry I came in late, but I just got back from work a little while